Siege units in Age of Empires 4 have been dominating the field since launch, especially Springalds before they were finally reworked. That said, after a few patches, a new villain may have emerged, and that is, of course, the boulder-hurling Mangonel. Welcome to Age of Noob, everyone! Sit back and strap in, as this is going to be an interesting one, and let's dissect this boulder-hurling, beautiful piece of machinery. As always, we'll first begin with some basic stats, conduct a few tests, discuss their place in the game, and see if the call for a nerf by some players is warranted. Let's dive right in. Without any upgrades, the Mangonel has 240 HP, 8 pierce armor, and 0.88 tiles per second movement speed. In terms of attack, the Mangonel, on paper, has 3 burst attacks of 12 siege damage and 24 bonus damage against buildings, but we'll investigate the damage mechanics in much more detail in just a bit. It can attack from a range of 9 tiles and has an attack speed of 6.75 seconds. Finally, although this isn't indicated anywhere in the game, the Mangonel unpacks to set up for an attack in 1 second and repacks to be able to move again in 2 seconds, so keep that in mind. In terms of upgrades, the Mangonel has a direct upgrade in the Siege Workshop called Adjustable Crossbars, which reduces reload time by 25%. You can also pick up Greased Axles upgrade to improve the Mangonel's movement speed from 0.88 tiles per second to 1.05 tiles per second, and Siege Works to improve its HP from 240 to 280, and Pierce Armor from 8 to 11. Of course, you can also research Military Academy in the Blacksmith to train them 25% faster. The Chinese are the only civilization in the game that do not have access to the Mangonels, as they get the Nest of Bees instead. But no worries, I'll cover them in a future video. The Abbasids can build Mangonels using their infantry as well, so keep that in mind when you're up against them. And finally, there is a Rus unique technology called Siege Crew Training that removes the time to set up and pack the Mangonel altogether. But given how weak Mangonels are in the Imperial Age, this technology is mostly irrelevant to them. Alright, with the basics out of the way, let's investigate how exactly the Mangonel's damage mechanic works, how much damage you can dodge, and whether or not there are other quirks you need to look out for. Let's take a look. First of all, even though this is not indicated anywhere either, the Mangonel has roughly a 3-tile minimum range. Thankfully, the UI of the Mangonel sites is pretty good, so you can clearly see the area in which the set-up Mangonel cannot attack. But here's the thing, since there's no such thing as friendly fire in this game, a bunch of nearby set-up Mangonels can easily cover each other's minimum ranges. Friendly fire and minimum range are a whole other can of worms that I'll open up later in this video, but keep those mechanics in mind for the upcoming tests. Okay, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, damage. There is zero indication of the radius of the Mangonel's attack in the game. We do know that the Mangonel is supposed to have 3 burst attacks for each of its 3 boulders, each dealing 12 damage. But what exactly does this even mean? Is the damage staggered? Is there an AoE for each boulder? To answer these questions and more, I've conducted a lot of tests, and there is some method to the madness. Here are my findings. Number 1. Units are damaged by either 12, 24, or 36 damage. There is no in between. Yes, it's determined by how far away you are from the impact zone, but enemy units will receive the damage in thirds, either partially, fully, or none if they're able to dodge it. Number 2. The Mangonel's shot isn't entirely accurate and doesn't deal the same damage throughout. Here's a better, exaggerated example. We can clearly see roughly 1.5 tiles of guaranteed damage. The inaccuracies come into play around the second tile, as you can see some men-at-arms barely surviving. The third tile is a mixed bag of either 1 boulder damage of 12 or sometimes 2 boulders worth of damage of 24, and this stems from the inaccurate shots. But you don't necessarily have to remember all these details, to be honest. The summary of all of this is that you could expect an average of roughly 30 damage within the 2-tile radius and 15 damage on the 3rd tile radius for each shot. Of course, this is a crap ton of damage per hit, as you can realistically deal a few hundred damage or more if the enemy units aren't in staggered formation. And yes, just like my video on the demo ships and their joke of a damage radius animation, Mangonels share that same fault with their water nuking cousins. As you can see, the 3 boulders are tiny, and the mark they leave on the ground, including the smoke and the dirt that poofs out, have roughly a radius of a tile, or maybe just a tad larger. But they deal damage to 3 times the radius of the animation. This is insane. Again, most players will be frustrated and confused because the animation just doesn't match the damage dealt at all, and Relic really needs to revamp the animation to match the high AoE damage Mangonels deal. This is yet another important gameplay clarity issue, not to mention that the Mangonels are also quite common on the battlefield. Alright, even if we assume that the impact animation is fixed, we know that Mangonels are supposed to deal a lot of damage, but one of its weaknesses surely should be its difficulty to hit its targets for balance reasons, right? Well, not quite, as it's a bit more nuanced than that. First of all, the projectiles are automatically hurled towards the trajectory of the enemy unit based on their movement speed, as the boulders behave as if they have ballistics from Age of Empires 2 researched. So, straight off the bat, target firing in Age of Empires 4 is almost a non-factor. Since Mangonels will do a better job hitting the target based on the enemy's exact movement speed, you're better off leaving the Mangonels be to snipe their targets from afar on their own. This is especially true if your opponent runs away outside of the base 9-tile range of the Mangonel, as the projectiles will travel as far away as possible to hit their targets. As you can see with the knight in this example, the Mangonel's range stretches an additional 3 tiles just to hit the fleeing knight. I'm not saying there won't be a niche in-game scenario where target firing will be useful, but leaving the Mangonels be will most likely deal more damage to enemy units than you targeting manually. Second, dodging Mangonel shots is difficult and you'll need a low ping to the server, some low latency gear, and a bit of practice to reliably pull it off. Let's do some tests. I started off with the Man-at-Arms, as they are some of the slower units out there in the game to test micro limits, and here's what I found. If you move before the boulders are released, you're almost guaranteed to be hit. It doesn't matter if it's milliseconds, the game calculates the trajectory of your unit based on its direction and movement speed, and because the projectiles reach their target so quickly in this game, your units won't be able to move out of the blast range in time to dodge it. This is also assuming you have the lowest ping possible. Okay, so then we just have to react after the boulder is launched, right? Well, yes, but it's not that simple. Depending on the movement speed of your unit, you have roughly 150 to 300 milliseconds to react. Depending on your internet connection and location, most players will have roughly 50 to 100 ms ping to their closest server. This means that most players will have about 1/10 to 1/5 of a second to react to the Mangonel shots to dodge them properly, with a guaranteed hit to the face if you misclick a tad too early before the projectiles are launched. In contrast, Age of Empires 2 gives you roughly an entire second to react. As mentioned before, this is to fully dodge the projectile with an average movement speed unit. If you have a faster unit or better ping or are okay with tanking some partial damage, then you can add a few hundred milliseconds. But I reckon that almost all units will require less than half a second of reaction time to dodge the bulk of the damage. Just to be fair, I did the same test with a knight, and indeed, it's easier to dodge despite being a larger unit. You could wait almost mid-projectile before moving to dodge, but this is still less than a second of reaction time. That said, hang on a second. Why am I even able to dodge the damage completely? Didn't we just say that the Mangonel's damage radius is 3 tiles? I tested this a few times and I found some inconsistency. As you can see here, when I target fired somewhere close by but not on top of the knights, they still take damage. Heck, the knights on the very side even took damage, roughly 2.5 tiles away from the target zone. Now, I'm not sure if this is intended or a bug, but it seems like if you're moving, you don't take damage around the outer sides of the blast radius. If you're stationary, the blast radius will most likely damage your units who are standing still. It's not that big of a deal since it's mostly just 12 damage, but it's still something to keep in mind. Also, what I just mentioned is often not applicable to most in-game situations. By the time Mangonels become relevant, you should already have many armies of at least 15 to 20 soldiers or more. All of these dodging mechanics work fine for a few units, or maybe a max of 2 lines of cavalry, but once you get to slightly larger numbers, it's next to impossible to dodge, period. Your reaction time and movement will determine how badly your units will be wounded, but they will be wounded nevertheless. To wrap up dodging mechanics, here are some quick summary points. Number 1. Never pre-move as the Mangonel will calculate your trajectory. Always change directions after the boulders are released. Number 2. If you have 10 units or fewer, keep them in a tight formation and try to dodge. Even if slightly late, you'll mitigate at least some of the damage with a chance of dodging it completely. Number 3. If you have a larger or an especially slower army, then use the staggered formation. You simply cannot dodge with a large army because army splitting just does not exist in this game, unfortunately. Until the developers add that, you'll have to cut your losses and maneuverability for the sake of mitigating as much Mangonel damage as possible. There's no other way. Oh, and here's the thing. All of this was just for one Mangonel. You'll really need to be careful and have sharp army movement and timing to be able to dodge 2 Mangonels firing at different rates. If they picked up adjustable crossbars and have 3 or more Mangonels, don't even bother trying to dodge. You'll have to stagger and charge into the Mangonels directly, or you'll simply have to make Springalds at that point if you cannot approach the Mangonels in melee range. Alright, that's pretty much all of the relevant information for Mangonel mechanics that I could think of. So let's move on to some tests and discuss balance right after. Testing Mangonels is a bit tricky as they should not be left unattended when you field them. That said, I'll still show a few examples just in case you run into those scenarios. Here's a test of equal resources with a Mangonel spaced out. As you can see, even the lowly spearmen that weren't even in staggered formation can easily handle them. Even if we scale up to a larger fight, the staggered men-at-arms can easily destroy them as well. I'm not even going to bother testing with cavalry, as the Mangonels will lose even worse to them. Hence, if you find enemy Mangonels undefended and have some melee units around, do not hesitate to engage at all. Heck, with some good micro, you could even avoid damage altogether. Range units, on the other hand, can still do well against undefended Mangonels, but you have to micro carefully here. The very low HP of range units cannot handle more than 2 or 3 Mangonel shots to the face. Hence, you have to dodge 1 or 2 shots on your way to their minimum range. Once you get there, you can easily destroy the Mangonels. If they choose to unpack, then you can simply follow them to wherever they go and always be within their minimum range. Horse archers, camel archers, or Mangudai do even better, as dodging projectiles and getting to the minimum range are much easier to pull off. In short, and as you can see, never leave your Mangonels undefended, or you'll lose some expensive units for nothing. Keep in mind that scouts, which only cost 60 food, are an excellent and cost-efficient way to deal with undefended Mangonels. Okay, with that out of the way, let's conduct some proper tests. This time, I'll add 10 spears to defend the Mangonels. When we go all out with spears and staggered formation, it's not even close. With a quick micro to dodge most of the damage from the first few shots, you can immediately focus down the Mangonels, then clean up the rest. There's no need to test with the mana terms either, as the result will be the same. Hence, if you have melee units of equal resources, mostly around 15 to 20 of them, then don't be afraid to engage even with spears defending. Even if you cannot dodge within the less than a half a second time frame, you'll still win the engagement, as the Mangonels will only be able to shoot once before having to pack up and move. The story is different with cavalry versus spear and Mangonels. It's not a good engagement to take, even if you micro the knights. Playing around spears that can brace properly makes maneuvering a nightmare, especially when you have to keep dodging the Mangonel shots if you're still within range. Okay, this is interesting, but we don't have time to go through every single possible matchup, so I decided to summarize my findings under 4 fundamental scenarios. Let's assume we're the attacker against the Mangonel and its defenders. Scenario 1. If the Mangonel's defenders match your own units, then you can confidently take the fight. For example, your army of 10 knights will destroy an army of 2 Mangonels and 5 knights. Or your army of 20 men-at-arms will destroy 2 Mangonels and 10 men-at-arms, and so on. This same principle will apply to range units as well, but you'll need a bit of skill to dodge most of the damage of the first few Mangonel shots. If you cannot deal with micro, then simply stagger and split your army while attacking the enemy units. You'll still win, but with fewer survivors. That said, if the Mangonel's defenders are counters to your own units, however, then it gets a bit tricky. Scenario 2. If the Mangonel's defenders are ranged counter units, such as crossbows versus the men-at-arms, then there's an added complexity of critical mass of the crossbows. The enemy will have to have a critical mass of crossbows to defend, and even a few melee units on the front to hold the line. Scenario 3. If the Mangonel's defenders are melee counter units, such as men-at-arms versus spearmen, then the unit with the higher unit count typically prevails. The reason for this is due to the Mangonels being overwhelmed and nuked down so quickly. 30 spearmen cost the same as 2 Mangonels and 10 men-at-arms, but the spears can simply rush the Mangonels while ignoring Mangonel shots and the damage from men-at-arms, then turn back against the men-at-arms to finish them off. Roughly half of the spearmen still survive this battle, so it's not even close. Scenario 4. If the Mangonel's defenders are melee units that swarm them, such as 30 spearmen or men-at-arms, then you'll have a really rough time for most army compositions. Prolonged fights where you cannot get close to the Mangonels to nuke them down quickly are awful ones to take, and in this scenario, you'll have to make some Springalds or match the enemy Mangonels with some of your own. Remember folks, Springalds can 3-shot Mangonels comfortably, and with some skill can even dodge Mangonel shots from maximum range. Even if you don't micro and tank the Mangonel's hits directly, you'll still be fine as a Springald. It is the de facto counter to the Mangonels, so make sure you make use of them whenever applicable. Sometimes you cannot make siege workshops due to an all-in strategy or build order, so keep in mind all of the tests conducted in case you cannot train Springalds right away. Apart from Springalds, the Mangonels are absolutely awful against other gunpowdered siege units. The cannon 2-shots the Mangonel with ease, and the Culverin blasts the Mangonel's primitive rocks back to where it came from without suffering even a scratch. Hence, Mangonels overall aren't that great against other siege units. Okay, what about buildings? How do the Mangonels fare against them? Well, the bonus damage of 24 actually applies for each of the 3 boulders, which means the Mangonels deal a total of 108 damage to a building per hit. For example, in 45 seconds, the Mangonel was able to deal 756 damage to this monastery, which is roughly 1000 damage per minute. In contrast, however, rams are much cheaper, but deal more than double the damage at 2400 damage per minute. They're also much tankier and serve a purpose for pushing as well. Hence, Mangonels are okay to attack buildings if you have them around, but definitely not a go-to unit to prepare for a siege. So, if they lose most of the equal resources fights, do awfully against melee units in numbers, and aren't that great against buildings, why do we have the notion that Mangonels are overpowered? I originally thought that it could be the training time, but it's not that either. An army of 10 spearmen and 2 Mangonels can be trained in 170 seconds from 2 production buildings, whereas training 30 spearmen takes 165 seconds from 2 production buildings as well. Okay, then it must be population efficiency, right? Well, Mangonels are so overwhelmed by Imperial Age units that it doesn't matter at all. One bombard takes up less population space than 2 Mangonels, but can easily take both of them down, not to mention Culverins. We don't really have to think about population efficiency in the Castle Age, so it's not that one either. Hence, when I put all of this together, I cannot find a proper argument to support the notion that Mangonels are overpowered. Personally, I would love to see the introduction of friendly fire in Age of Empires 4, and perhaps an addition of a second or half a second of packing time for Siege to move again. Some numbers will require tweaking after the aforementioned are introduced, but even without them, I think the Mangonels overall seem quite fine. You just have to be careful and use a bit of micro, as you have multiple options to deal with them in both the Castle and Imperial Age. I personally got into making this video with the mentality of proving how OP Mangonels were, but after all these tests, I proved myself wrong. You simply have to know when to pick your fights and maneuver your army properly, and avoid prolonged fights where you cannot get close to the Mangonels. And yes, I know I did not test the Mangonels with adjustable crossbars, but I don't think it really mattered in the tests either. Mangonels still lose to both Springalds and Gunpowder Siege units. They still lose to melee charges because 25% is not enough to squeeze in an additional shot most of the time, and they still cannot out-DPS the ram against buildings either, not to mention that adjustable crossbars is a relatively expensive technology that takes a minute and a half to research. So yes, you'll get more value out of your Mangonels in the long run if you train quite a few, but the tech doesn't change the way they're played. All that said, do let me know in the comments below if I missed something or an important mechanic that makes the Mangonels OP or better than they seem in the video, but I'm pretty sure I covered all angles here. Mangonels definitely pay their worth if they're kept safe in prolonged fights for sure, such as being behind walls while shooting down the enemy units perhaps, but in most open maps, defending them is quite difficult, unless there are nearby town centers, keeps, or walls to prevent the enemy from diving them. Furthermore, if the split formation is added to the game for an additional army control and the projectile and impact animations are reworked, the Mangonels will actually get a direct nerf from just those already. Their 600 resources cost is simply easy to match with melee units that can rush them down in numbers. Well, that's pretty much all you need to know about the Mangonels in Age of Empires 4. I did expect this video to be quite a long one, and boy was I right. If you enjoy this type of analytical Age of Empires content, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel to see more of this stuff. I'm doing my best to upload a few quality videos per week, so make sure you stay tuned. The Mangonels were suggested in the comment section below a while back, so be sure to continue typing suggestions of game mechanics that you'd like me to explore. As always, thanks for watching everyone, don't forget to sharpen your micro against Mangonel shots, and see you all in the next one.